Today, me and my group are going to be addressing the topic of gun control laws, and two of us are going to be arguing for, and two of us are arguing against these laws that are currently in place. Now, I'd like to introduce the rest of my group, and I'm Alec, and there's Nick, Faison, and Sasha, and we're going to be addressing the topics that I just mentioned. Now, when you see a civilian carrying a gun, do you feel threatened or safe? And does ownership of a weapon create a more hostile environment or a safer one? Now, with ownership of guns, the safety of the general public may increase. However, it may also have adverse effects. So should the government implement laws enforcing gun control? Now, we as a group have conducted thorough research from various sources on the different arguments in favor of and against gun control laws. And regardless of your stance on the issue, you will most likely be affected by the decision to be made on it, and the use of gun control laws, or lack thereof, will affect your perception of how safe you really feel. Now, for the cons, which will be argued by Nick and Faison, they're stating that the Second Amendment already prevents owners from possessing firearms used for unlawful purposes. More control over gun ownership will not stop criminals from gaining ownership. It will only stop lawful citizens who actually use them properly. Now, people have the right to protect themselves, especially when the police are not able to respond right away. Now, on the pro side, which will be argued by me and Sasha, the Second Amendment does not permit civilians to possess a firearm whenever and wherever they please. Gun control will decrease the amount of gun-related deaths, as they both lead in homicide and suicide-related deaths. And most victims do not utilize guns to protect themselves from a threat. So increasing gun control will have a negative effect, and a negligent effect overall. Now, the first argument that's going to be made is by Faison against gun control laws.
Okay, so the first argument that I'd like to state is that the Second Amendment protects individual gun ownership. The Second Amendment allows for an individual's right to own a gun, and citizens are given the right to bear arms, as we see in the specific court case, which is the District of Columbia versus Heller. This case is about the District of Columbia putting a ban on owning and registering of handguns. The chief of police at the time was the only person allowed to provide permission for owning a gun for a one-year period. A policeman named Heller sought to register his handgun but was denied. He argued that under the Second Amendment, he was allowed to own a gun. And he took this to court, and the court agreed that Heller was correct and that the Second Amendment granted him that right for protection and other lawful purposes. So just goes to show you that the Second Amendment grants us this right for our protection, for the use of guns for our protection and other legal activities, and we shouldn't have to worry about it being taken away from us.
Now, Faison, to argue that point, now countries with restrictive gun control laws, other than the United States, have lower gun homicide and suicide rates than the U.S. does. Now, for example, Switzerland is ranked third in gun ownership overall, with rates of 45.7 guns per 100 people. And a study by the Small Arms Survey in 2009 said that gun homicides are around 0.31 per 100,000 people, and gun suicides are 3.29 per 100,000 people. I guess instances involving guns. Now, the U.S. is ranked first in gun ownership rates, with gun ownership rates of 88%, or 88 per 100 people. And in 2007, an aggression and violent behavior study stated that the U.S. has 4.19 per 100,000 people deaths involving gun homicides, and 5.76 deaths per 100,000 people involving gun suicides. Now, this is because the U.S. has very permissive gun control regulations as it is, whereas Switzerland has extensive background testing before issuing a gun license. Now, this would bring me to my second argument, that more gun control laws would reduce gun deaths. Now, the Center for Disease Control reports that there were 464,033 total gun deaths between the years 1999 and 2013. Now, 58.2% of those total deaths are suicides, 37.7% are homicides, and 2.2% of those deaths were unintentional. Now, guns were the leading cause of death by homicide at 66.6% of all homicides, and suicides at 52.2% overall. Firearms were the 12th leading cause of all deaths, representing 1.3% of total deaths, topping liver disease, hypertension, and Parkinson's disease, as well as deaths from fires, machinery accidents, and drowning. Guns are a huge cause of violent crime, and they need to be dealt with. They are used in a great deal of deaths and shouldn't be left uncontrolled.
Okay, Alec, to counter that point, I'd like to say that gun control laws do not deter crime, gun ownership deters crime. In John Lott Jr.'s book, More Guns, Less Crime, Lott says that since gun control became limited in Canada in 1998, the homicide rate has risen while the United States homicide rate has fallen. The author also states when handguns were banned in Britain in 1997, the crime rate nearly doubled. Serious violent crime rates from 1997 to 2002 averaged 29% higher than in 1996. Robbery was 24% higher, and murders were 27% higher. Before the gun laws changed, armed robberies had fallen by 50% from 1993 to 1997. But as soon as handguns were banned, the armed robbery rate shot right back up to where they were prior to the change in 1993. And now the violent crime rates in England has double that of the United States. In another article, The Great Gun Control Fallacy, journalist Thomas Sewell notes that under Britain's gun control laws, armed robberies have increased from a dozen per year in the 90s to hundreds per year in the present day. He also explains comparisons of gun ownership within different countries. For example, ownership is 3 times as high in Switzerland as is in Germany, but the Swiss have had lower murder rates consistently. This shows that gun control laws do not matter in relation to the prevalence of crimes, and the two are independent variables. The next point I'd like to bring up is that gun control laws infringe upon the rights to self-defense, and moreover, they deny people a sense of safety. Gun control laws infringe upon the rights to self-defense. According to the National Rifle Association and the Gunners Association, they claim that guns are used in self-defense 2.5 million times per year, or rather 6,850 times per day. According to Armed Criminals in America, in May 2013, 48% of surveyed convicted felons admitted that they avoided committing a crime when they knew the victim was armed with a gun. This is because they were afraid of the victim being able to fight back and causing serious injury to themselves during the process of committing a crime. Civilian gun ownership is necessary to deter criminals from carrying out their crimes.
On the other hand, guns are rarely used in self-defense. Gun owners are actually far more likely to hurt themselves than someone else doing it. And the Violence Policy Center also concluded that guns are far more likely to be stolen than used for self-defense. As stated in Firearm Violence from bjs.gov, between 2007 and 2011, less than 1% of violent crimes involved victims that protected themselves with a firearm. It was the least employed protective behavior. So people aren't utilizing the firearms in the main way that has been the most argued reason for having them. Also, research conducted by VSP.org found that in 2010 there were only 230 justifiable homicides in which a citizen used a firearm to kill a felon. So if all of this research discredits the fact that most guns used are not used for self-defense, why continue allowing them to be purchased when clearly they aren't being used properly? And the final reason for gun control laws is that these laws would reduce the societal costs associated with the gun violence. A lot of money goes into not only monitoring and preventing gun violence, but also dealing with the aftermath, whether that be health-related, economical, or even psychological. According to the World Health Organization, the cost of gun violence can include legal services, medical costs, psychological costs, among many others. So there are so many repercussions associated with gun use that not only directly affect the individuals involved, but spreads even further and affects the country as a whole. According to the Pacific Institute of Research and Evaluation, gun violence cost the U.S. government $5.5 billion in lost tax revenue, $4.7 billion in court costs, $1.4 billion in Medicare and Medicaid costs, and millions more in mental health care, insurance claims, and law enforcement. These costs are extremely high and clearly highlight that something needs to change in order to correct for these immense costs. So as you can see, there is an issue that easily cannot be ignored. It is not only a monetary issue, but affects individuals physically, psychologically, and those effects can last for decades.
Gun control laws such as background checks and micro-stamping are an invasion of privacy, though. Background checks will require government databases that keep personal individual information on gun owners, including their name, addresses, mental health history, criminal records, and even more. None of that information online is 100% safe, and it could be accessible to determined individuals that have the ability to hack into these systems, as well as government officials who are not law-abiding. According to journalist Amber Phillips in her article, gun control legislation probably isn't going anywhere in Congress. There's a potential worry that there will be searches of the databases and an expansion for purposes that were not initially thought of when the information was collected. This misuse of data is something that we've all seen on the news and is definitely an issue you'd want to avoid. Microstamping similarly requires a database of gun owners and the codes on their personal guns stamped on their cartridge cases. Senators Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz wrote that they would oppose any legislation that infringes on this right without being subjugated to government surveillance. So the right to bear arms should not mean that anyone who owns a weapon should be under surveillance. That is a direct invasion of our privacy because of a basic right that is given to all of us. In conclusion, the topic of gun control is definitely very detailed and requires in-depth analysis. Our pro side argues countries with restrictive gun control laws have lower gun homicide and suicide rates rather than the United States. Additionally, gun control will lower gun-related deaths on average. Firearms are not utilized the majority of the time during a violent threat, so increasing regulation will not make a huge impact in that sense. Having more gun control laws would reduce societal costs in relation to the gun violence. Alternatively, the con side to gun control has argued that the Second Amendment protects the individual's right to bear arms. Additionally, more control will not stop criminals if they're determined to possess a gun. This just means that that criminals have a chance to have more control over situations than civilians do. And finally, firearms should be an option for civilians to protect themselves when the police are not able to assist immediately, because there's a waiting time between an issue occurring and a reaction from the armed forces. Gun control laws, and the final reason is that gun control laws are an invasion of privacy. At the end of the day, though, gun control is a very complex issue, but most importantly, it's in the hands of you, the public, to ensure how safety is perceived. Thank you very much for listening to us, and we hope you learned and made your own decision.